Picture a 17-year-old girl in her first university lecture hall. The professor puts a word on the screen, and she raises her hand, not to answer, but to ask what it means. The word is Holocaust. The room goes silent. She isn't joking. She has simply never been taught it, because until this month, she had never set foot in a classroom in her life. No school, no birth certificate she could trust, a childhood spent on a mountain, waiting for the end of the world. And yet, 10 years from this moment of silence, this same girl will hold a PhD from the University of Cambridge. This is the story of how she got there, and of the price it would take from her, her own family, and very nearly her own mind. Her name is Tara Westover, and she grew up on a peak in rural Idaho called Buck's Peak. Her father saw a shape in the mountain's rock and pine, a woman he called the Indian Princess, and he taught his children that the mountain was their whole world and their only ally. There were 7 kids. Several, including Tara, had no birth certificate. No one was entirely sure of her birthday. She had never seen a doctor, never been enrolled in a school. As she would later write, she had been educated in the rhythms of the mountain. It sounds almost beautiful, but that education had one iron rule that set her family apart from every family around them. A rule spoken like scripture: we don't go to school. The reason was her father. He was a devout, charismatic survivalist who believed the government was coming, that doctors and public schools were tools of a corrupt world, and that the days of abomination were near. So the family stockpiled fuel and food and buried guns after he heard how the government had, in his telling, slaughtered a family for keeping their children out of school. Years later, Tara would learn that story was distorted, but as a child, she only felt the fear of it. Her father's conviction was total, and it filled the house like weather. The children learned to see the world exactly as he saw it. And that raises the quiet, dangerous question at the heart of everything that follows. What happens to a mind that has only ever been given one version of reality? The danger wasn't only in ideas. Because hospitals were forbidden, Tara's mother became an unlicensed midwife and a herbalist, treating burns and breaks and births with tinctures in her own hands. And because her father ran a scrapyard, the children worked among falling iron and shearing machines, with no safety gear and no plan for when something went wrong. Tara learned young what her mother called the art of shutting up, of saying nothing to teachers or doctors who didn't exist in her life anyway. It was a childhood of real skill and real love. But it was built on a bet that faith and the mountain would always catch them. Sooner or later, that bet was going to be tested against a moving car and a sheet of ice. The tests came. A long night drive ended in a crash that left her mother with a serious brain injury she never fully recovered from, and still, no hospital. Later, there were more accidents. A fall in the scrapyard, a fire, a second wreck on a frozen road. Each time, the answer was the same: God's will, the mother's salves, and home. The bodies healed crooked or slow, and the family folded each near disaster into proof that they'd been protected rather than proof that they were in danger. Tara absorbed the lesson that pain was normal and that the outside world had nothing to offer her. But one member of the family was quietly deciding that couldn't be true, and he was about to open a door she didn't know existed. His name was Tyler. He was the brother who wore headphones and played Mozart in a house that ran on noise and hard labor, the one who seemed tuned to a frequency no one else could hear. And one day, Tyler announced he was leaving Buck's Peak to go to college. Their father was contemptuous. College, he said, is extra school for people too dumb to learn the first time around. But for Tara, something had cracked open. If Tyler could walk off the mountain into a classroom and not be destroyed, then the edge of her world was not the edge of the world. She didn't have the words for it yet. She only had a question that would not go quiet. What was out there? But before that question could pull her outward, another force pulled her down. Tara had an older brother. In the book, she calls him Sean, who could be magnetic, funny, protective, the one who taught her to ride and gave her a private nickname on long drives. And then, without warning, he would turn. What had been affection became control and violence, physical and verbal, in the family's own home. This is a memoir about abuse, and it is handled here the way the book asks, as her account, without spectacle. What matters for the story is the wound it left in her head. After each incident, she was told and told herself that it hadn't really happened, or that she had caused it. Love and fear started wearing the same face. That is how a mind gets rewritten from the inside, Each time the past was denied, Tara denied it a little more herself until she could no longer be sure which version was real, the thing she remembered or the thing everyone insisted on. She began keeping journals, then writing second versions that softened what she'd first set down, editing her own memory to keep the peace. It is the most frightening kind of erasure because it doesn't feel like being silenced. It feels like doubting yourself. And so a new open question took hold, one that would haunt the rest of her life. Whose version of the past do you trust when the people you love need you to remember it wrong? It was Tyler again who named the way out. Home from college, he looked at his younger sister and said plainly, "The longer you stay, the less likely you will ever leave." There was a world out there, he told her, and it would look very different once their father was no longer whispering his view of it in her ear. He pointed her at a single narrow gate, a college entrance exam called the ACT. Passing it would mean teaching herself, alone, the algebra and grammar and science she had never been given, by lamplight, between shifts in the scrapyard, with her father certain the whole plan was a sin. She had no reason to believe she could do it. Therefore, quietly, she decided to try. So she studied. She wrestled trigonometry she had no foundation for, failed a first attempt, and tried again. And on the second try, she scored high enough. At 17, the girl with no transcript and no schooling was admitted to Brigham Young University. She packed a bag and drove off Bucks Peak toward a classroom for the first time in her life. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like stepping onto another planet without a map, because she was about to discover that leaving the mountain was the easy part. Belonging anywhere else was the thing she had never been taught how to do. Which brings us back to that silent lecture hall. At university, Tara was fluent in survival and illiterate in the ordinary world. She didn't know the everyday rules other students breathed without thinking, about study, about hygiene, about history. And yes, she raised her hand and asked what the Holocaust was, and felt the room turn to look at her. She nearly failed courses, then taught herself how to learn and began to excel. But the deeper vertigo wasn't academic. Every new fact was quietly contradicting the only reality she had ever been given. She was not just catching up on an education, she was being handed a second version of the world and being forced to decide, alone, which one was true. Money almost ended it. She was poor in a way her classmates couldn't see, working while she studied, dreading the tuition she couldn't pay, and everything in her upbringing screamed that government help was the devil's bargain. A bishop urged her to apply for a grant anyway. When the aid came through, it didn't feel like charity. For the first time, she could simply be a student and eat and think. And there it is, the first crack in her father's map of the world. The institution she'd been raised to fear had just done what her fear never could. They'd given her room to become someone. The question was no longer whether she could survive out here. It was who she might turn into if she let herself. Then came the sentence that changed her life, and of all places, a psychology lecture. Studying mental illness, she recognized, with a jolt, symptoms that matched her own father, a possibility the family had never named. In a history class on civil rights, she confronted the ugliness of a slur her brother had used against her and understood for the first time that it was wrong. Piece by piece, she saw how completely she had been formed by other people's certainties. As she put it, he had defined her to herself, and there is no greater power than that. So a new resolve hardened in her, not to hate where she came from, but to do the one thing she had never been allowed, to live inside her own mind and not inside someone else's. That resolve carried her further than she dreamed. A professor helped her win a place studying abroad at the University of Cambridge. Standing on a chapel roof in a hard wind while others clung to the stone, she found she could stand upright, unafraid, as if the mountain had trained her for exactly this. A renowned professor read her writing and told her it was as though she had stepped out of a play about a girl transformed. Another mentor, Dr. Carey, watched her doubt that she belonged among the polished students around her and told her something she would carry forever. You are not fool's gold, shining only under a certain light. The gold was always in you, not in Cambridge, in you. Believing that, even a little, changed what she reached for. She applied for one of the most competitive awards in the world, the Gates Cambridge Scholarship, and the girl who had once had no birth certificate won it. She would return to Cambridge not as a visitor, but as a graduate student, fully funded on her own merit. It was the kind of ascent that belongs in a fairy tale. And yet, on the day she was honored back at university, the seats where her parents should have sat stayed empty. That was the shape the rest of her life would take. Every door she opened in the world seemed to close another one at home. She was rising. She was also, slowly, being asked to choose. At Cambridge, she studied the very idea she was living. She read philosophers who defined freedom as self-mastery, the rule of the self by the self, the power to take control of your own mind. On a wall, she copied a line from a Bob Marley song. None but ourselves can free our minds. And in a small, enormous act, she finally did something her upbringing had forbidden her whole life. She saw a doctor and got vaccinated, reclaiming ownership of her own body along with her own thoughts. She was, by every outward measure, free. But freedom of the mind, she was about to learn, is not the same as peace, because the past she had escaped had never agreed to let her go. The pull came through her sister. In the book, she calls her Audrey, a sister who had also been hurt by their brother, and who now wrote asking Tara to help her stand up to him and to their parents together. For a moment, the impossible seemed near. In one exchange, their mother appeared to believe them at last, writing words Tara had waited her whole life to hear. "You were my child. I should have protected you." Imagine holding that sentence after everything. Tara let herself hope that the truth could be spoken out loud and survive, that she could keep her new self and her family both. Therefore, she went home to try, and that hope is exactly what the next winter would break. When she pressed the truth in person, it collapsed. Her father demanded proof. Her mother's belief evaporated back into silence. Her brother's menace turned toward her directly, in one wordless, terrifying scene, rendered here only as she recalls it. He made unmistakable that she was not safe, and then the ground fell away beneath the one thing she thought she still owned, her memory. Her mother now insisted the frightening events had simply never happened, that there had been no knife, no threat, nothing. Her sister recanted too. To keep loving the family, everyone agreed to remember it. Westover's way was a lie. She was offered a place among them at a single price. Stop trusting what she knew to be real. It was the loop from her childhood come round again, and this time, refusing it would cost her everyone. The cost nearly took her. Awarded a visiting fellowship at Harvard, she should have been at the summit, and instead, she came apart. Sleepless, panicked, wandering and crying out in the night, torn between two irreconcilable realities. Her parents flew to her, not to reconcile, but to reclaim her. Her father offered a priesthood blessing to cast out what he believed had corrupted her. And in that room, she finally saw the whole bargain clearly. What her father wanted to cast out of her, she realized, was not a demon. It was her. To accept his blessing was to agree, once and for all, that she would lose custody of her own mind. She had spent her life being handed other people's certainties. This was the moment she had to keep her own, or have none. She refused. She chose not to attend her father on his terms, knowing it might mean losing her parents for good, and it did. But refusing was not only loss, it was authorship. She stopped editing her journals to please the people who needed her memory rewritten, and let the record stand as she had first lived it. "Who writes history?" she asked. "I do." And she was not entirely alone. One brother, Tyler, the same brother who had first walked off the mountain into a classroom, chose to stand with her at real cost to himself, and the book is dedicated to him. She came, finally, to a hard and generous peace. She was not the child her father had raised, but he was still the father who had raised her. She could hold both, love the mountain and refuse to live on it, honor where she came from without surrendering who she had become. The estrangement did not stop hurting. It simply stopped being a question about whether she was allowed to exist. So, how does a girl who never went to school end up with a Cambridge PhD, and why did it cost her everything? Because the diploma was never the point. What she was really earning, exam by exam and heartbreak by heartbreak, was the right to trust her own perception of the world, to keep custody of her own mind when the people she loved most needed her to give it up. That is the real distance she traveled. Not from Idaho to Cambridge, but from living inside her father's certainty to living inside her own. She could call the change many things: transformation, betrayal, a self built from scratch and paid for in full. She chose one word for it, the same word that had once been forbidden to her on the mountain. "I call it," she wrote, "an education. And that is a kind of learning no classroom can give you, and no one can ever take back."